So if you're just joining us, we're waiting just a few moments before we get back to our opening remarks, and then we will get into our question and answer portion. Thank you all for sticking with us. Okay, and we're going to pass it back to Mara. My apologies. I'm just going to go ahead and reintroduce you for our viewers here. We're going to hear a few remarks from Mara before we go into our question and answer. Mara Hayden Hilliard is a civil rights lawyer, a co-founder of the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund, and ally of countless social justice movements from across the country. Again, she's speaking to us from Washington, D.C. Welcome, Mara.
It's a pleasure to be here. And just to reiterate what I was saying before we had some technical difficulties, I mean, I've just seen this documentary for the first time, as with everyone else. It's really so well done, such an important piece of information. And I do want to encourage everybody who saw this to do everything they can to circulate this, to make sure that it gets seen across the United States. This is information and a message that people have to hear. They have to understand what's happening here in Aurora, in Denver, and understand that at the very core, the very simple, the very basic issue that's in play here is that Joel and Lillian and Terrence and Eliza are being targeted for one single reason, and that is because they were engaged in First Amendment protest and were effective at it. They are organizers, they are racial justice and social justice activists, and the police have gotten away with murder, and they want to get away with murder, and they want to act with impunity. And when you have people who are willing to speak up and stand up for what they believe in and stand with others and organize others and act with their conscience, and the police feel the repercussions of that, repercussions that are peaceful repercussions, but repercussions that show the power of the people in the street demanding change. That's what they want to stop. So these people are being targeted to shut them up. That is the goal here. The goal is to punish them, to silence them, and to scare everybody else who would dare challenge the impunity of the police and the prosecutors. They have, as I said, gotten away with murder. They're hoping that they can continue to get away with murder. And they can't if the people are loud enough and make the demand that we all understand, which is quite simply, Elijah McClain should be alive right now. He should be alive. The only reason he's not alive is because he was murdered, and those murderers have to face justice and should not be allowed to have their guns and their right to deprive people of liberty and to be able to storm through the communities. They should be in jail. And this is a simple and just demand, and one that is so infuriating to the police and the prosecutors who want to have the license to do whatever they want to whomever they want. They want to be able to act with complete impunity for racist police violence and have no one say anything and have no one speak out. And because people did, they have taken the entire power of the state to target people that they believe are leaders, and that they believe by punishing them, they can shut down a movement. And of course, they can't shut down a movement for justice. That's the nature of a movement for justice. It is driven by the beliefs of people who are going to stand and fight for what they believe in and engage in protected First Amendment activity. That's what happened here. And that's why we have to send this message across the United States, because the targeting and the attack here on these activists and these organizers is intended to send a chilling message. And we have to send a message back, which is that all of us are going to stand together with them. We're not going to tolerate it. We're going to fight back. And we're going to make sure that there is justice for Elijah McClain and justice for those who are being targeted with this outrageous and appalling prosecution.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mara. Now we're going to move to our question and answer portion. If you would like to pose a question to our panelists, You can type it into the chat or the comment section if you're joining us from social media. We're going to answer as many questions as time allows. While people begin submitting their question, I'm going to introduce the rest of our panel. We have Joel Northam, while living in Brooklyn, organized for justice with many families of police murder. He moved back to his hometown, his home state, I should say, of Colorado in the summer of 2020, and helped build a spontaneous anti-racist struggle into a sustained mass movement in Denver. Joel is an organizer with the PSL who could face 42 years in prison. Then there's Lillian, who has been involved in the struggle for justice for Elijah McClain since the first visual on the first day after his death, and has been one of the foremost organizers in the mass peaceful protests against police brutality in both Denver and Aurora in the summer of 2020. Lillian is also an organizer with the PSL and could face 48 years in prison. Terrence Roberts, who founded several youth-oriented social justice projects, including Prodigal Son Initiative, Heal the Hood Movement, and the Colorado Camo Movement. He also founded Frontline Party for Revolutionary Action, which worked alongside the PSL to lead the peaceful protest movement against police brutality for justice for Elijah McClain. Terrence is again the co-founder of FPRA, and he could face years in prison as well. Eliza Lucero, who has been a part of the Elijah McClain movement since the early months following his death, helping out put on protests, speaking out at city council meetings and bringing public awareness to his case. Eliza is also an organizer with the PSL, and she could face 19 and a half years in prison. And lastly, but certainly not least, we're joined by Will Whiteman, who's an award-winning documentary filmmaker, video journalist, and breakthrough news creative director. Will travel to Colorado to capture the stories of these protest leaders and the struggle for justice in Elijah McClain. So with that, we're going to begin with our first question. And that is, how did Dave Young get away with this? That is the former district attorney. It seems that this is a blatant corruption and your protest brought attention directly to him. Seems he is using his power to take out his political opponent. That's our first question. Let's go to Joel, if you'd like to provide a response.
Sure, I can provide a response. How did Dave Young get away with this? I honestly, I can't speak to what was on Dave Young's mind at the time, but I think that the answer can be found in the question of how did other officials, how do people that are racists get away with doing racist things throughout the history of this country? It's the same question. It's like, how do they get away with it? It's because we live in a racist country. That's how they get away with it. And because using the institutions of the state to reinforce this racism is a time-honored tradition in this country. And Dave Young knew this. And these killer cops know this as well. It's one of the reasons why they feel like they can get away with the things that they get away with impunity. It's because they have gotten away with it with impunity for such a long time. I can't speak to exactly why Dave Young decided to pursue this, but it might have to do with the fact that his term is up. He's no longer going to be the DA in Aurora. So it may have just been, he just wants to throw something against the wall and see what sticks. Personal vendetta, who knows? But we do know that there are new DAs, and we hope that they do the right thing and drop these charges.
Thank you. Now, our next question is for Will. The question is the documentary team continuing to film as the cases are fought? Looks like we are experiencing sound issues. So we'll go to the next question. The question is, what can someone in another state do besides sharing the documentary and signing the petitions? Let's go to Lillian.
Well, first of all, thank you everyone for being on here, and thanks for your support. If you want to, help raise the demand to drop the charges, one thing that's really useful is to write the new DAs like Joel just mentioned. Dave Young and George Brockler were term limited, which is really great. They were out of office this Tuesday, and we really hope that these new DAs who didn't start this political prosecution will drop it, will do the right thing and not continue to prosecute it. And so we really encourage people to write them. There are postcards that you can actually even order on the site. denverdefense.org, which are really beautiful. And, you know, any proceeds from that go to our legal and political defense fund. But actually there's a bunch of different ways to support. So I would really recommend checking out denverdefense.org. There's a support page on there.
Thank you. Okay, we're gonna go back to Will, if we can. The question is the documentary team continuing to film as the cases are fought?
So we're going to keep a very, very close eye on what's going on. And my intention is to make a follow-up film as things develop. So yes, we will be returning to the subject. You will be seeing more from Breakthrough News relating to the issue.
Thank you. Okay, our next question is, what are some of the lessons that you have all learned from this protest movement, and how have they helped you build the movement for justice? Perhaps let's hear from Terrence.
So we definitely see, excuse me, everybody. We definitely see how entrenched fascism still is in this nation. You know, we're fighting fascism, but I mean, it's here. You know, we look at the crimes of Donald Trump, what he's definitely doing in front of billions of people, and yet he still holds power, right? Even to this day, even while impeached. So it showed me that, you know, they are still afraid of pro-social movements like Black Lives Matter, Trans Lives Matter, you know, people fighting police brutality, people taking power and resources away from police sources that are really abusive to the people. So, you know, if anybody was not aware that they are still targeting peace organizers, that the police are still brutalizing people, then I think we all learned that lesson, that COINTELPRO is still real. Fascism is real in this country, and we have to keep fighting. You know, first it was out of your homes and into the streets. Now it's, you know, back to the streets, because we still got to keep fighting.
Thank you. Our next question is, seems like the organizers, it seems like the charges against the Denver organizers are much worse than what people are seeing who stormed the Capitol being charged with. Is this true? That's perhaps Eliza, if you'd like to share.
It does appear to be like a double standard in this sense when we see I don't want to call them activists, fascists storming the Capitol building and, you know, pretty much being welcomed in by the police force there, as opposed to a mass movement of the community and of the people who came out to demand an end to violence, to demand justice for our communities. There does seem to be a double standard there. However, these aren't really comparable events, I'll say. What we're facing is because there was power in the movements of the people. We saw this summer that when people come out in the masses from all different backgrounds to say enough is enough, that there is so much power there, and so that's really why they're targeting us, is because we were what they assume to be leaders of these mass demonstrations, demanding an end to the violence.
And I just want to jump in there on this issue. I mean, there is, as Eliza said, there's no comparability between this at all. I mean, here you have peaceful protesters, people who are engaged in classic First Amendment protected activity. I mean, all summer across the United States, millions of people came out in the streets. Millions of people were demonstrating in front of police stations. I mean, these are public areas. That's where you're allowed to be. You're allowed to stand. You're allowed to chant. You're allowed to express your point of view. This is lawful activity. It is completely different than the fascist, violent, murderous mob that attacked, assaulted, physically assaulted, smashed their way into the Capitol building. These are just completely different things, but it does bear recognition, as I think was the point of the original question, which is that in fact, people who committed actual crimes, unlike anyone here, are being charged with very, very minor offenses in many of these cases. And that goes again to what this issue is, which is it's an effort to actually punish political protest activity, no matter how peaceful, no matter how lawful. It has nothing to do, and in fact shows the falsity of the arguments about law and order, because everyone here was engaged in, peaceful, protected First Amendment activity, and that's why they're being attacked, because they were effective, because they were good organizers, because they stood up against the police department's illegal, murderous conduct. That's why they're targeted.
Excellent response. Thank you, Mara. So we have a couple of questions about how people can support. We're going to go to Lillian. The first is, can people donate to help this political defense and public mobilization? And the second, also for Lillian, is, I'm a member of a union, and what the lawyer said about this kind of persecution potentially impacting unions really stuck with me. What can my union do about this?
Yeah, thank you for those questions. So if you want to donate, you can donate on denverdefense.org or on Venmo at donate4Denver. I can't underscore enough how long and costly this process is. It's something that is hard to wrap your head around until you're in it. We've between us, been to well over a dozen court dates. And, if this goes to trial, this is really going to be a many months long process. So we really appreciate the financial support. That's been really crucial. For the union question, that's such a great question. There's actually been an initiative started called Trade Unionists for Justice in Denver, which is speaking to exactly this connection between, this kind of political crackdown and what it could mean for labor organization in the future. As we know, these repressive tools which are developed now really do lay the groundwork for bringing them down on workers in the future who are, just advocating for their democratic rights as well. So it's very important to defend our democratic rights now. And so you can visit Trade Unionists for Justice. That's the number 4. I think we can put that in the chat. We'll link to it. And if you're a union organizer, please sign on to the solidarity statement, as a trade unionist yourself. But also, one thing you can do is work to get any labor organizations that you're part of to sign on and back an endorsement or a resolution to drop these charges. If there's anyone from the Denver Area Labor Federation on, we just really want to give you a shout out. This is a huge trade union federation that backed us while we were still in jail, and really just came out boldly calling on the Aurora DAs to drop the charges. And that was an incredible statement of solidarity from 90,000 workers and their families in Denver. So we really appreciate the trade union support.
Thank you. Okay, our next question is, how have the police used data and social media to repress you all and the movement? What does that signify for you all in this struggle? We're going to ask Joe, and then if others have a response, they can feel free to chime in. Joel?
So, because this is an ongoing case, I'm not going to speak too much on specifics of how they've used social media or data on our particular case, but I just will say that all across the country, the police have entire divisions dedicated toward monitoring people's social media. And we have to remember that Twitter, Facebook, like all of these are platforms where, on the one hand, yes, they can be good insofar as, okay, people can post events and they can have mobilizations and they also can provide educational materials for people that are interested in getting into organizing and activism, and they're a great way to share news. On the flip side of that, though, we have to remember that these are platforms that are owned by capitalists from Silicon Valley. Like, these are people that mine data, that collect data, they share information with the government, and they're ultimately tools of surveillance and repression and counterintelligence that's used by the state in order to suppress movements. Time after time, like, we hear stories about entire cases being built against activists from just tweets that people have said, that people have tweeted out. We see situations where there's just major disinformation campaigns, ways to discredit organizations and people. We see all kinds of ways that the police use social media to suppress. So we just have to be very, very careful. And remember also at the same time is that like the revolution isn't going to happen on social media. You know what I mean? The struggle is not going to have, the struggle is not on social media. The struggle is going to be, you know, like how we interact with people. It's how we build with community, communities that are affected by police terrorism and environmental racism and whatever. We have to remember that the real struggle is in building with our neighbors, because, you know, this society will have us feel like we're isolated, and social media sort of gives us the idea, oh yeah, we're not isolated. There's so many people that we can just connect with, you know, just like that. But we have to remember that these are platforms that are owned by people with very nefarious interests against justice and against people that are struggling for just basic dignity.
Thank you. And if anyone else would like to respond, again, the question is about social media and data and how police use it to crack down on protesters.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to that, actually. I mean, so we all know that, of course, they're going to use our speeches and they're going to use our crowd sizes. And, you know, no one's ignorant to the fact that they're going to use our social media accounts against us in court. Lucky for us, we do not advocate for violence. So there's no evidence of any violence on anything that PSL has ever posted or FPRA, right? So if you are an organizer or just a common citizen, just please do understand that if you put it on social media, it is evidence and it is public, and they will use it against you. It can also be your evidence to show that this is the real intent. And, you know, we have a right to be on Facebook or social media platforms advocating for peaceful demonstrations. We are not advocating for violence, and we never have. And that's what makes this whole thing ridiculous. This is why we're sitting here today, because we all know that we're all innocent, right? So just be careful, man. Social media, it can have its pluses and its minuses. Like Joel said, you know, the movement is not going to be there. You know, if that's all you have, we're not ableist either. Like, use what you have. But if you can get out there and organize with the people, if you can do a good deed for your neighbor, then that's what it's all about.
Thank you. Okay, now we have a couple questions for Mara. The first is, I know that the Attorney General announced a grand jury investigation for the Elijah McClain killing. What can we do to put pressure on so we don't see the same watered down charges that were presented in the Breonna Taylor grand jury trial? And the second is, what do we make of the governor initiating a grand jury?
Well, I think, you know, Mari Newman addressed this right away, and she was very clear about this and so right about this issue of the grand jury, which is you don't need a grand jury to indict these officers. I mean, you don't. And if they're going before a grand jury, the only way that a grand jury could fail to indict these officers would be if the information is not put in front of them that is the full truth. So the only way that there's going to end up being a failure of a grand jury indictment will show an intentionality on the part of the prosecutors in terms of what they provide that grand jury. So I think it's really important for people to be, you know, continuing to organize on this issue and speaking out and demanding justice, because the only reason that there has been a grand jury is because of this movement. There would be nothing if this movement for justice for Elijah McClain was not so powerful and reaching so many corners that they have to respond to it. But what they're hoping to do probably is to respond to it by saying, we have a grand jury, have the grand jury, as these grand juries do across the country, come back without an indictment, then they can say, we tried. And it's really critical that people make it clear that that's not going to be acceptable.
Thank you. Our next question is for Eliza. It says, it seems like you all are giving the cops and prosecutors more than they bargained for fighting back against this case. What's the importance of organization?
The importance of organization. organization is vitally important to this struggle, because as we saw, I guess, in the early months of George Floyd, or as we've seen in the past, such as like with the Occupy movement, struggles that don't have organization, that don't have leadership, they are easily disrupted, and it is they don't come to any sort of ends or means. It's important to have very, very sharp, very clear objectives and demands. And so being organized, being a part of an organization is so important for that, to have leadership, to bring that to a struggle, especially a spontaneous struggle like we saw this summer take off. We definitely are giving these cops more than they bargained for. And I think that that's something that this documentary really emphasized was, like when Joel says Aurora is not used to having things disrupted, these cops and the law enforcement that we were challenging, they're notoriously corrupt and known for violence. And it took an immense amount of courage for these people to come out from all different backgrounds in the community. You know, we were bringing out thousands of people in our in the community to demand justice. That took an immense amount of courage, and having organization to have the ability to do that, to stand up against corruption, against brutality, is everything. It is so important.
Thank you. Our next question is for Will. The question is, what was your main objective with the documentary?
Documentary was obviously to just give voice to all people involved in it, because I mean, all I was really doing was just really assembling everything, because this is just such an important story to tell. The ridiculousness of the fact that these activists are the ones charged while no police officers are facing any kind of justice whatsoever. You know, I'm not from this country, as you might be able to tell from my accent, but I mean, it's a message which is reverberated around the world. I mean, we certainly had solidarity protests in London. And so really what I wanted to do was just to put it into a bundle that made it so shareable as possible, so that this story, this sort of grand narrative, this whole thing could be spread far and wide, so that we can bring the forces of public attention on to bring scrutiny on this issue.
Thank you. This next question is, can you talk about how you were treated in jail? Why were you held for so long? Perhaps I can pose this to any of the three demonstrators that were in jail for it was 8 days, I believe. How about we ask Lillian?
I saw Eliza starting. We can go to Eliza.
Oh, could you repeat the question just one more time for us, Andrew?
Of course. It's, can you talk about how you were treated in jail and why were you held for so long?
Yes. How we were treated in jail. So jail is a horrific experience. Jail is torturous, especially in the United States. People are treated like animals. You are put in a cage. During COVID, they're using this pandemic as an excuse to hold people in near solitary confinement conditions, which is an additional mental torture on top of, the already existing tortures that go on in jail. It's terrifying because you hear stories of people being killed by guards in jail and dying from entirely preventable causes. Especially in our case, we were in the hands of the people that we had been challenging all summer. So it was increasingly terrifying for us to know that we were a little bit helpless. However, we were not entirely helpless, because we had a huge struggle from our community and from our organization demanding that we be released and keeping eyes on, the guards and the jails themselves. Why were we held for so long is a question that we are trying to get to the bottom of ourselves. You are typically, by law, you are required to see a judge within 48 hours. We were held several times over that amount. So it made this prosecution just more blatantly political, and we are immensely relieved to not be in jail anymore.
Thank you. Okay, now we're going to go to our last question, and it says, "It is great that Russ's charges were dropped, but it is still scary that this happened, and I worry about further attempts to silence protesters. Are you worried about further retaliation?" We'll go to Lillian.
Yeah, that was amazing news that Russell's charges were dropped in their entirety. I think that was a major relief. Russ has a 7-month-old baby. I mean, it just really, and Russ has done nothing wrong. It just underscores how arbitrary this all was. And I think it's definitely the good, the right first step. But yeah, I would definitely not say that this is over in any way. It's scary that this happened. It's still ongoing. We're still very much fighting this, and the charges hanging over our heads are very much still real. So I wouldn't want to give anyone the impression that this is a done deal. This is very much a battle. And I believe the other part of the question, are we worried about further retaliation? I mean, this is why it's so important to continue to beat these charges and to not give in. I mean, we are ready. We will go to trial. We are not going to back down. We have to defeat these charges, because it is not just a fight to keep us out of jail. It is a fight for our right to continue protesting. I mean, everything that we've done this summer, we need to be able to continue to do. We need to be able to continue leading protests that have power, that the police are uncomfortable with. That's our right. And we're not going to allow them, when there's obviously such a need for continued protest. Black people are still being murdered by the police on a daily basis. Are we at a point where we can allow the police to restrict our rights to protest to ones that don't bother them, that don't challenge them? Absolutely not. And so, it's extremely important that we defeat this case, that we show that we will come together and not allow the prosecutors to scare us away and scare us out of fighting, and that we continue to push for justice in Elijah's case, specifically here locally. Like it was mentioned, Elijah's case is still open. There's still the possibility for criminal charges against his killers. And so we need to continue to fight all the way. And so I would just reiterate that, that is in Phil Weiser's hands. We got to keep our eyes on that. We're not backing down, and we really have to defeat this case. So thank you to everyone who's, supported and shown up to this today. We really appreciate having so much, so many people behind us.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, the panelists, for joining us. That's all the time that we have for today. But if you want to learn more, you can visit our website at denverdefense.org. Again, that's denverdefense.org. And on the site, you can also take action today to support the fight to drop all the charges against these protest leaders by visiting denverdefense.org/take-action. I'm going to drop that in the chat now. And there you can sign our petition, you can donate, you can write postcards. Lastly, don't forget to follow us on social media at Justice in Denver on Facebook and Instagram. The film will be available online. Please be sure to share that and circulate it. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and enjoy the rest of your day.